Okay, let's jump right into it. We've taken a deep dive into a stack of recent reports, specifically the Criticality Analysis series from the IMANI Center for Policy and Education.
Right.
These are unpacking some key governance and economic issues happening in Ghana during, well, the first week of June 2025. Our mission here, to cut through the noise, pull out the most important nuggets, understand the forces really at play, and, figure out what these developments mean for you and the bigger picture.
Basically help you get genuinely well-informed fast.
Exactly.
And these reports, they don't shy away from the complex stuff. We're looking at everything from intense legal standoffs, testing the Constitution, to the health of Ghana's democracy in a pretty turbulent region, how public money is really being used locally.
Right, the local load.
Shifts in the currency, and those, ever-present energy sector challenges. It's a look at just how interconnected these seemingly separate issues are.
Totally interconnected. And let's start with the one that really grabbed headlines. A serious legal and constitutional standoff involving the Office of the Special Prosecutor, the OSP, and former Finance Minister Ken Ofori-Atta.
Yeah, that one's big.
What's the core situation as presented in these reports?
Well, the reports detail how the OSP signaled Ken Ofori-Atta had become, and this is their phrasing, a fugitive from justice.
Wow.
And they decided to seek an Interpol red notice. This all traces back to OSP inquiries launched way back in January 2025 concerning 5 separate corruption matters.
5 separate matters. Okay.
And they asked Ofori-Atta to show up for questioning back on February 10th.
And his response, what did he say?
Well, his legal team responded with medical documentation. It apparently showed he was receiving treatment abroad.
Okay.
Abroad. They offered to cooperate remotely, but crucially, didn't give a firm date for his return to Ghana.
Okay, so he's ill, getting treatment, offers remote cooperation. How does that escalate to fugitive and an Interpol red notice? That seems like a big jump.
That's exactly the tension the reports highlight. As the deadlines the OSP set passed, the OSP framed these delays as, evasion.
As evasion.
Right. So by June 2nd, with no physical appearance or what they considered a clear, unwavering travel plan, the OSP triggered the red notice.
Wow.
And that action basically internationalized what started as a local investigative issue.
And here's where it gets really thorny, isn't it? The reports point out the core conflict here. The OSP insisting on an in-person appearance versus Ofori-Atta's constitutional rights. What rights specifically are we talking about?
Primarily Article 19 of the Constitution. Now, this covers fair trial protections, but, and this is key, for someone charged with a criminal offense. And the reports are very clear. The OSP themselves stated Ofori-Atta is not charged with a criminal offense at this point.
So wait, hang on. They're treating someone as a fugitive from justice and seeking an international arrest notice without actually charging them with a crime.
That's the crux of it.
How does that tension play out from different perspectives in the source material? This sounds legally complicated.
It is, and this is precisely where the legal analysis in the reports comes in. You have Kofi Bentel, VP at IMANI, who sees this as a potential constitutional crisis.
A crisis? Why?
He argues that calling a suspect a fugitive just for not attending an investigatory session undermines that fundamental innocent until proven guilty guarantee in Article 19.
Okay, so he thinks it risks trial by media, essentially convicting someone in the public eye before any actual charges are laid.
Exactly. And he argues it sets a dangerous precedent for the OSP's power. Where does that stop?
Right.
Bentel's view, as presented, is that once the OSP has enough evidence, then they should file formal charges in court.
In court.
At that point, the accused gets all the constitutional safeguards of a fair hearing, presenting evidence, cross-examining witnesses, all that, even potentially in absentia if the court allows it under specific circumstances.
Okay.
He argues due process is there to protect individuals and empower the judiciary, which is the proper venue for determining guilt, not the OSP's investigatory office.
Okay, that's one side. But there's another perspective in the reports, isn't there? What does the OSP side say?
Yes. Samuel Apaya-Darko, who's the Director of Research Strategy and Communication at the OSP, offers a counterpoint. His argument is grounded in procedural law.
Procedural law? How so?
He argues that Ghanaian statutes, and actually Article 19, Clause 3 itself, forbid a trial in absentia until a suspect is formally arrested and charged.
Ah, so only after arrest and charge.
Correct. His position is that without that formal step, There's simply no legal basis to proceed virtually or compel the process in that way at the investigation stage.
So he's saying remote cooperation isn't really provided for legally before charges are filed.
Precisely. And he feels Ofori-Atta's medical correspondence, the letters back and forth, wasn't sufficient to excuse the requirement for personal engagement. From their perspective, waiving that requirement would essentially allow suspects to dictate the terms of investigations, which could erode the OSP's ability to do its job effectively.
What's fascinating here, as the analysis points out, is that this isn't just about Ofori-Atta, is it? It reveals a fundamental tug of war in Ghana's legal system right now.
It really does. It's a conflict between what the report calls constitutional fervor, prioritizing individual rights and due process even at the investigative stage, and procedural rigor.
Procedural rigor.
Meaning sticking strictly to the step-by-step legal process, which says, look, you can't even consider a trial format, virtual or otherwise, until there's a formal arrest and charge.
So one side warns of sort of political theater and overreach if you label someone a fugitive prematurely.
Yeah, trial by media, damaging reputations.
And the other side warns that without firm rules and consequences at the investigation stage, rules become toothless and just invite manipulation and delay.
Exactly. And the reports note both perspectives have valid points. There's merit on both sides.
So what are the wider implications then? This feels significant for Ghana's legal system.
Oh, they're huge. If the OSP's demand for physical appearance before charges holds, could wealthy or well-connected suspects potentially use travel and health claims to evade scrutiny indefinitely?
That's a risk.
Or, conversely, if suspects can force remote interviews or virtual appearances whenever they prefer, does that weaken investigative agencies' authority? Does it make it harder to compel critical information and testimony?
It's a real balancing act.
Absolutely. The way this balance is struck will set precedents for future corruption probes. It'll impact investor confidence in Ghana's governance framework, rule of law perceptions.
And public faith in justice, too, I imagine.
Definitely. Public faith in the fairness and effectiveness of the whole system. It's unresolved, this whole thing. It could potentially lead to court challenges clarifying Article 19 versus the OSP Act, or even legislative changes, maybe like a mutual legal assistance framework to handle these kinds of situations better.
Yeah.
This saga is really a landmark moment, a true test for Ghana's rule of law.
Okay, so from testing the rule of law in a specific case, let's zoom out to a broader governance challenge the reports highlight. Ghana's democratic stability in a region that feels, increasingly fragile.
Yeah, the scene painted across West Africa is certainly worrying. We've seen military juntas take power in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger.
Right, the Sahel region particularly.
And at the same time, you have civilian regimes in countries like Côte d'Ivoire and Togo appearing to use legal and constitutional means to basically consolidate power.
And often without much significant pushback from regional bodies, the reports say.
That's a key point. Ghana has often been seen as, a bright spot, a democratic exception in this neighborhood, but the reports caution that this reputation alone isn't some kind of permanent shield.
It's not guarantees.
Not at all. The concern raised is that when leaders start disregarding constitutional mandates and regional blocs are weak or silent on this kind of democratic erosion, the question stops being, can a democracy fall? And starts being when and how.
That's a sobering thought. The reports also point to internal weaknesses within Ghana itself, right? They reference some specific studies.
They do. Mololo Kofi-Koda is cited regarding what he calls democratic illiteracy.
Democratic illiteracy?
Yeah, the idea that maybe many citizens lack the deep civic knowledge needed to fully engage, to recognize manipulation, or to resist it effectively.
Okay.
And what else? Victor Adechala's work is mentioned, highlighting a surge in institutional mistrust, people not trusting key institutions, particularly the Electoral Commission.
Right.
And there's this widespread feeling that formal democracy, elections and voting, isn't actually translating into real-world improvements or opportunities for ordinary people.
That disconnect.
Exactly. And Adams Mubarak's research reinforces this, noting persistent corruption, impunity for the elite, political exclusion. These things continue despite decades of constitutional rule. They're like cracks in the foundation.
And you also mentioned other factors.
Yes, you also have things like embedded political violence, vigilantism, electoral thuggery. Mm-hmm. These are unfortunately still part of Ghana's democratic landscape. Mm-hmm. And then there's significant frustration among young Ghanaians facing high unemployment who might see politics as a closed shop, not offering them a future.
That creates a volatile mix.
It does. A latent space, the reports suggest, where democratic norms could potentially be challenged.
And then there's that contagion effect you mentioned from the neighbors. Can you give us the examples the reports use?
Absolutely. Look at Togo, for instance. In April 2024, there was a constitutional amendment. It basically changed the presidency to a ceremonial role and transferred executive power to a new position, President of the Council of Ministers.
Okay, what was the effect of that?
The practical effect. It allows President Faure Gnassingbé, whose family has been in power for nearly 6 decades, to potentially bypass term limits and stay in control.
A way around the rules. And how did the government respond to the youth-led protests against this move?
The reports mention repression, tactics like internet blackouts being used to stifle dissent. It's a pretty clear example of using legal maneuvers to undermine the democratic rotation of power.
Okay, and Côte d'Ivoire. The reports describe that situation as maybe more subtle.
More subtle, perhaps, but equally concerning from a democratic health perspective. Ahead of their 2025 elections, the reports say institutional processes were used to bar key opposition figures. Names like Laurent Gbagbo and Tidjane Thiam are mentioned.
Barred them from running. How is that justified?
Well, the analysis suggests that judicial and electoral bodies maintained very rigid interpretations of existing rules, which had the practical effect of sidelining credible opposition.
So the process looked legal, but the outcome?
The outcome, according to the analysis, is that with little genuine competition left, Côte d'Ivoire risks sliding into what's termed a managed democracy.
Managed democracy, meaning
one where the rules and institutions are used primarily to validate the existing power structure, not necessarily to facilitate open, fair contestation.
Right. So the reports are basically saying that seeing coups succeed in one place or seeing constitutional norms twisted like this without strong regional consequences, it makes these actions seem more appealing or acceptable elsewhere.
Precisely. It kind of normalizes the erosion of democracy. When citizens start feeling like elections are just rituals without real accountability, and regional bodies like ECOWAS appear weak or divided in their response, then even established democracies can falter. The analysis makes an explicit link, for example, between the appeal of military regimes in the Sahel and the perceived failure of civilian governments there to provide basic security and opportunity for their people.
That's a powerful connection. So what's holding the line in Ghana right now, according to these reports? What are the buffers?
They point to institutions like the courts, active civil society organizations, faith groups, and, crucially, independent media. These are seen as vital checks and balances.
But there's a critical warning attached to that, isn't there?
Yes, a very important one. That these institutions need constant renewal, they need strengthening, and perhaps most importantly, they need genuine political will from leaders to maintain their legitimacy and effectiveness.
They can't be taken for granted.
Exactly. The moment leaders start seeing these institutions as inconvenient obstacles rather than essential pillars of governance, that's when, as the reports put it, the dominoes gain momentum.
And the stark conclusion offered is that Ghana faces a choice.
A pretty stark choice between being the firewall that resists these regional authoritarian trends or, sadly, becoming the final tile to fall.
Wow.
It's a powerful warning about the need for vigilance and a deep commitment to democratic principles, not just, having the right institutions on paper.
Absolutely. Okay, so from that macro picture of democratic stability, let's drill down to a very practical challenge: how public money is managed at the local level. The reports cover a significant financial allocation for local government, but there's a big catch, right?
A very big catch. The big news is the finance minister announced nearly $988 million for the District Assembly's Common Fund, the DACF, in just the first quarter of 2025. Now, the reports highlight this is roughly double the highest annual allocation in recent years.
Double the annual amount in one quarter. That's huge.
It is. And it's seen as a significant step towards fiscal decentralization, getting money closer to the ground.
That sounds like great progress. More money going directly to the local level where it's arguably most needed. So what's the catch? What's the paradox?
The paradox the reports highlight is this: pouring this much money into local government without first fixing the fundamental accountability structures that have historically undermined the effective use of these very resources.
The accountability piece. And they back this up with data, right? From the Auditor General's reports.
Absolutely. Concrete data. The reports from 2021 to 2023 show a consistent, troubling pattern of underdelivery and misuse. Net transfers to assemblies, the money actually getting to them, consistently hovered between just 65.9% and 76.2% of their allocated shares.
So they weren't even getting the full amount officially allocated to them.
Correct. Big chunks were deducted or delayed before even leaving the central level, and then even of the amount they did receive.
Yes.
A significant chunk, somewhere between 14.8% and 20.5%, was lost to irregularities, according to the audits. Misapplication, questionable spending, that sort of thing.
That's alarming. So how much was lost overall then, before the money could even be used effectively on the ground?
Well, the analysis crunches the numbers and reveals that close to 2/3 of the funds available were routinely lost, either through those central deductions, leakages at the local level, or delays before the money ever really hit the Assembly's actual budgets for projects.
2/3 potentially lost or delayed. Can you give us a specific example from the tables in the report, just to make it concrete?
Sure. Let's look at 2021. GH 511 million was allocated on paper. Only GH 390 million actually reached local budgets.
Okay.
And of that delivered amount, GH 66 million vanished into irregularities flagged by the Auditor General. Or 2023, GH 326 million allocated, only GH 215 million received locally, and then nearly 15% of that net sum slipped through the cracks due to irregularities.
Wow. Okay, so this isn't just a glitch. It's clearly a systemic issue, this underperformance.
The reports definitely characterize it that way. It's not just technical problems. It points to deeply embedded habits. Things like opaque procurement processes, uneven oversight, maybe incentives that don't really align with genuine public service.
It's like having a leaky pipe system, isn't it?
Exactly. And the reports suggest simply injecting more water, doubling the allocation isn't enough if you don't first fix the leaks in the pipe.
Right. So how do you fix a broken pipe system? Do the reports offer solutions beyond just highlighting the problem?
They do. They bring in ideas for reforming public financial management. Franklin Cudjoe at IMANI, for instance, speaking at the National Economic Dialogue in 2025, rejected the old principal agent model.
Principal agent model.
Yeah, the one he says is built on suspicion and just checking compliance boxes. He called Ghana's governance machinery a broken machine. You know, archaic rules, low morale.
So what did he propose instead?
He proposed what he called a stewardship model.
Stewardship? What does that involve?
It focuses more on intrinsic motivation, building ethical commitment from public servants, and radical transparency. The idea is that people are motivated by more than just rules and penalties. They want to do good work.
Interesting.
Dr. Sang Goodell also advocates for this kind of thinking, describing public servants as stewards of national resources for their communities. He draws lessons from places like New Zealand and Singapore.
So it's about building trust and a sense of responsibility, not just imposing more controls from the top down.
Yes, but critically, he insists stewardship must complement robust controls, not replace them entirely. It's about turning audits, for example, into public conversations about outcomes and priorities, not just ticking boxes on paper compliance.
Okay, so that's the ideal. But how does this compare to the government's actual approach with this new big DACF allocation?
Well, the reports describe the 2025 rollout posture as basically cash first, reform later.
Cash first, reform later.
Yeah. I mean, yes, they are transferring 80% directly now, which is a positive step for fiscal decentralization compared to the old way of calculating net transfers after deductions. That's an improvement. But the accountability framework still largely relies on submitting paper expenditure returns.
And that paper trail just doesn't show the real picture on the ground.
Not according to the analysis. Paper reports can't easily tell you if that borehole funded is actually pumping water, if the market construction actually boosted local trade, if overcrowding in classrooms really decreased.
Right.
They don't easily flag things like inflated procurement costs, contracts given to cronies, or projects that were paid for but then abandoned halfway through.
So the risk with this massive cash injection without the reforms
is significant. History suggests, the reports argue, that higher transfers without those foundational reforms in place could just lead to a similar scramble for the resources.
A scramble.
Worse, the analysis suggests, larger sums could potentially embolden rent-seeking behavior people trying to get a slice of the pie improperly. This could lead to even bigger leakages and more ghost projects if that stewardship mindset isn't firmly rooted alongside the cash.
Okay, so what are the concrete recommendations coming out of this analysis? How do you put the brakes on this budgeting without brakes scenario?
The reports and the proposals discussed suggest several practical things. First, you have to marry the funding with stewardship. District assemblies should co-create quarterly work plans with citizens. Make them public. Publish live progress reports online. Invite independent civil society observers to their budget hearings.
Real, active public transparency.
Exactly. Second, use outcome-based metrics for funding. Link disbursements not just to submitting paper reports, but to actually meeting agreed performance corridors, for example, proving that 90% of the boreholes planned are actually operational and providing water.
So payment for results, not just paperwork.
That's the idea. Third, pilot innovative audits. Things like participatory budget audits.
Participatory audits.
Yeah, blending the official audits done by the Auditor General with verification processes led by the community itself, getting citizens involved in checking the work on the ground.
That sounds powerful, getting citizens involved.
And finally, embed stewardship culturally. Training for local government officers needs to include values-based curricula, intrinsic motivation, moral accountability, and crucially, political will from the top. Ministers and chief directors should model this by, say, publicly releasing their own performance evaluations.
Lead by example.
Precisely. The conclusion is powerful. This cash infusion can lead to transformation, but only if reform and funding are treated as two sides of the same coin.
You can't have one without the other.
Right. The test isn't just budgeting more money, it's institutionalizing trust and accountability just as rigorously as the budgeting process itself. Otherwise, like you said, you're just making the leaky pipe bigger.
Got it. Okay, let's shift gears now to the broader economic picture. The reports have some interesting news about the Ghanaian cedi. Seems like some good news for a change.
Yeah, this is the good news part. The cedi has seen a really significant appreciation in 2025. After starting the year with a depreciation of around negative 3.9%, it actually surged to a 24.1% appreciation against the US dollar by May.
Wow, 24.1% appreciation. That's a big swing. What's behind this turnaround?
It seems to be a mix of factors, according to the analysis. Globally, the US dollar has weakened a bit.
Yeah.
Domestically, factors include rising gold reserves at the Bank of Ghana and also the impact of discipline, fiscal, and monetary policies being implemented as part of the IMF program.
Right, the stabilization efforts. Okay, so good news for the cedi. But while overall inflation's down to 18.4% in May, which is better, the reports note that food inflation is still stubbornly high, over 22%.
Still sticky, yeah. And this is where the cedi's appreciation presents both an opportunity and, well, a challenge, particularly for agriculture, which is so key for overall stability and food security.
Okay, let's break that down. How is a stronger cedi an opportunity for agriculture?
Primarily, it makes imported agro inputs cheaper. Things Ghana imports a lot of, like fertilizers, seeds, chemicals, even machinery.
Right.
Cheaper dollar means these cost less in cedi terms for farmers. The reports even highlight the significant value of machinery and electrical equipment imports in 2024, mentioning things like bulldozers and herbicides as major imports that should now cost less.
That must benefit poultry farmers too, I imagine, with feed and chicks.
Yes, exactly. Cheaper imported day-old chicks and key feed ingredients like maize or soy if they're imported.
Okay. And for consumers, what's the direct benefit?
It reduces the cost of imported food staples, things like rice, wheat, sugar, cooking oil, which Ghana imports a lot of.
So that could help slow down that high food inflation number.
Potentially, yes. It could put more disposable income in people's pockets and ease some of that pressure.
So that's the upside, the opportunity. What's the challenge or the risk with a stronger cedi, especially for agriculture?
Well, the primary risk is for local producers. While chipper food imports benefit consumers in the short term, they can severely undercut Ghanaian farmers, particularly in sectors like rice and poultry, where we only struggle to compete on scale and cost against imports. Cheaper imports make that competition even harder.
It's a tough balancing act.
It really is. The reports emphasize the need for a delicate balance between giving consumers relief and protecting domestic production capacity.
And what about exporters? You mentioned agriculture makes up over 70% of Ghana's non-traditional exports. Does a strong cedi hurt them?
It can pose a risk, yes. If the cost of doing business within Ghana, things like wages, local transport, utilities, doesn't fall significantly alongside the cedi's appreciation.
Right, if local costs stay high.
Then Ghanaian exports become relatively more expensive on the international market. Exporters could lose market share or see their profit margins shrink. And that could discourage investment in developing those high-value export chains we need.
The reports also mentioned a potential link to electricity prices. How does that work?
Yeah, the idea is that the cedi gain and lower overall inflation could theoretically lead to eased or stabilized utility tariffs. especially if debt servicing costs on the energy sector's dollar-denominated debt are reduced because of the exchange rate.
Ah, the debt costs less in cedi.
Exactly. If those savings aren't rigidly passed on through tariff formulas, cheaper power would of course be a major boost for agro-industrial producers, helping them compete.
But the analysis is pretty clear, isn't it? While a stronger cedi helps on the margins, the long-term solution for food inflation isn't just about currency fluctuations.
Absolutely not. It's fundamentally about boosting domestic productivity through strategic, long-term investment.
And the reports highlight Ghana's structural weakness here.
Yes, a heavy import dependence. In 2024, Ghana imported around $2 billion worth of food. That's estimated to be over half the national supply for some key commodities.
Wow. Over half.
This massive import reliance exposes the country to external price shocks and undermines efforts to build domestic capacity.
So what strategic investments are needed then? What do the reports point to?
A whole range of things are detailed. Things like scaling up support for local fertilizer blending plants to reduce import costs, investing seriously in seed research and developing certified domestic seed systems.
Getting away from reliance on imports.
Exactly. Reducing the fiscal pressure that comes from import-heavy subsidy programs. Crucially, scaling up agro-processing to cut post-harvest losses.
Those losses are huge, aren't they?
Estimated at a massive 20–30% for some crops, so investment in industrial hubs, but also small-scale equipment accessible to farmers, like dryers and mills.
And logistics must be key, too. Getting food from farm to market efficiently.
Absolutely vital. Improving feeder roads, market linkages, investing in cold storage facilities, aggregation centers. Expanding irrigation is another huge one.
How much land is irrigated now?
Only about 2% of arable land is currently irrigated in Ghana. That makes production highly vulnerable to rainfall patterns and climate change. We need more year-round production capacity.
And mechanization, moving beyond basic tools.
Sailing mechanization, perhaps through agricultural service centers, supporting smallholders to access equipment, maybe even promoting local assembly and repair facilities. The GRW24 initiative is mentioned as a policy aiming at some of these areas, reducing imports, cutting losses, improving logistics.
But one thing really stands out in the reports regarding agriculture's potential.
Yeah.
It's the massive financing gap, isn't it?
It's huge, just stark. Despite agriculture contributing over 21% of Ghana's GDP, the sector gets very little finance.
Really? How little?
Foreign direct investment, FDI, into agriculture between 2018 and 2024 was less than 2% of total inflows into Ghana. In 2024 specifically, it was just $1.5 million for 3 projects. That's a tiny 0.24% of total FDI that year.
Less than 1/4%. Wow. And domestic credit from banks.
Also marginal. Less than 5% of total bank lending typically goes to agriculture.
Why is that? Why so little finance for such a key sector?
Well, the perception of high risk is a major factor, according to the Gersel 5th anniversary report cited in the analysis. Banks see agriculture as risky, so they price loans higher if they offer them at all.
And collateral is an issue, too.
Big issue. Smallholders and many agribusinesses often lack the traditional collateral, like land titles, that banks require.
So even with a favorable macro trend, like a stronger cedi potentially lowering input costs, the sector's potential can't really be unlocked without addressing this fundamental financing challenge.
Exactly. It needs targeted credit schemes, maybe blended finance models, bringing together public and private funds, and financial instruments that are actually designed for the realities of agriculture, its scale and its structure.
Right. Okay, finally, let's look at one more major economic issue covered in the reports. An amendment to the Energy Sector Levies Act, ESLA, and a controversial new fuel levy.
Yeah, ESLA. This goes back to December 2015. It was set up specifically to try and tackle the massive debts and structural challenges in Ghana's energy sector.
How did it work?
It basically consolidated various existing levies on things like petroleum products into one framework. The idea was to raise dedicated funds to clear arrears owed to power producers and fuel suppliers, and also finance reforms in the sector.
And the revenues were supposed to be ring-fenced, kept separate.
That was the plan. The revenues were meant to be ring-fenced, and ESLA PHOG was set up in 2017 as a special purpose vehicle to manage the debt, essentially issuing bonds backed by these anticipated levy collections.
Okay. The reports list the existing ESLA levies on petrol and diesel before this new change.
Yes, before this amendment, the existing ESLA levies totaled about GHP 1.42, so 1 cedi 42 pesewas, per liter. Plus, you had the special petroleum tax on top of that, which was around GHP 1.88 per liter back in January.
So quite a few taxes already built in.
Definitely. Before this new levy, all those taxes combined made up about 14.32% of the average petrol price back on June 5th.
And we'd seen fuel prices declining recently, partly because of that cedi appreciation we just talked about.
Right. Between January and May 2025, petrol prices at the pump had actually dropped by about 7.3%, and diesel was down 5.7%. Consumers were finally seeing some relief.
Okay, but now there's this new levy. What is it exactly?
Correct. A new GH11 Ghana cedi per liter levy has been introduced under this ESLO amendment.
1 full cedi per liter. That's substantial.
It is. And this one is specifically earmarked, the government says, for energy sector shortfalls, particularly covering the rising cost of fuel imports needed for the thermal power plants.
Okay, so how does this new levy change the picture at the pump? What's the impact on the price breakdown?
It's significant. It pushes the ESLA component alone up to GH 2.42 per liter. That now makes up about 18.4% of that June 5th pump price example.
So ESLA itself is almost a fifth of the price now.
Pretty much. And total fuel taxes, including ESLA, SPT, and others, rise to about GH 3.88 per liter. That's nearly 30%, 29.55% to be precise, of the pump price now just made up of taxes and levies.
Wow. So it basically eats into those recent savings consumers were enjoying.
Exactly. The reports give a really clear example. For someone spending, say, GH 1,000 a month on petrol, their earlier savings from the price drops were around GH 73. This new GH1 levy cuts those savings almost in half, reducing the net saving to just GH 37.
Ouch. And this must link directly to transport fares, too, which have just dropped recently.
Absolutely. Transport fares had recently fallen by 15%, partly because of the stronger cedi and those lower fuel costs. But if transport operators now factor this new GH1 per liter levy into their operational costs, which they almost certainly will,
fares could go back up.
Fares might increase again, directly undoing that benefit for commuters and potentially adding to inflation pressures again. It's a perfect illustration of how household gains from positive macro trends can be quickly offset or eroded by new taxes or levies.
Okay, so what's the government's stated goal for this levy? It's projected to raise quite a bit of money, right? GH 5.7 billion annually.
That's the projection. The stated purpose is a short-term cash injection.
For what exactly?
To ease immediate arrears in the sector, restore guarantees to fuel suppliers, basically keep the fuel flowing for the thermal plants to prevent dumpsore or power outages, and generally stabilize short-term energy supply and confidence. It's framed as an immediate fix for immediate problems.
Okay, an immediate fix. But the reports offer a pretty strong critique of this approach, don't they?
They do. While acknowledging it might provide some immediate cash relief, they argue quite forcefully that this levy does not fix the underlying causes of Ghana's recurring energy crisis.
What are those underlying causes?
The core issues remain largely unaddressed, according to the analysis. The government still owes billions. The figure cited is over $3.1 billion to independent power producers, IPPs.
Right, the IPP debt.
And much of this is under rigid power purchase agreements, PPAs, those take-or-pay contracts that many argue need fundamental renegotiation.
And fixing the inefficiencies at ECG, the distribution company.
Yes. The reports stress that collection inefficiencies and high technical and commercial losses at ECG must be fixed. Without addressing these fundamental structural problems, renegotiating those burdensome contracts, and fixing distribution leakages, the analysis warns this new levy will likely only delay the next crisis, not actually solve it.
So kicking the can down the road, essentially.
That's the concern raised, and there's also a crucial issue raised about transparency and accountability for all these levied funds, right? Not just the new one.
Yeah, what about that?
Well, ESLA already includes levies supposedly earmarked for specific services like sanitation and public lighting. But the reports note that problems in those areas persist, which raises legitimate concerns about whether the existing levied funds are actually being used as intended and delivering results.
So as consumers are asked to pay even more through this new levy.
Exactly. There's a critical need for much greater transparency on how all these ESLA funds are managed and whether they genuinely translate into the promised improvements in services, be it sanitation, streetlights, or now reliable power.
The government says this new GH1 levy will be ring-fenced specifically for energy operations and fuel procurement.
That's the stated intention, yes. To fund fuel buying and operations, perhaps without needing to hike electricity tariffs even further right now. But the reports rightly raise questions about how effectively such ring-fence funds are actually monitored and protected from diversion or misuse, especially given the history with other earmarked funds. Is the oversight strong enough?
So the need for robust accountability is absolutely paramount here.
Absolutely essential. Things like transparent, regular reporting on exactly how much is collected and how it's used, periodic independent audits, genuine legislative oversight by Parliament. Without these strong systems in place, the risk is this new levy just becomes another significant burden on consumers and businesses without delivering the tangible, lasting improvements needed for the energy sector's sustainability and reliability.
Okay, wow. So we've really deep dived into some incredibly complex and interconnected issues today, all drawn from these recent IMANI reports, starting with that high-stakes legal battle that's really testing the very principles of constitutional rights and the fight against corruption.
A real stress test. Then zooming out to the fragile balance of Ghana's democracy within a, frankly, turbulent regional neighborhood, exploring the potential cracks in its foundation and the external pressures it faces.
We looked at the very practical challenges of channeling significant public funds effectively for local development, confronting head-on those historical issues of accountability and the potential for leakage, even with good intentions.
We analyzed the double-edged sword of the cedi's recent appreciation, good news in some ways, but bringing its own risks for local producers and exporters and really highlighting those persistent, massive financing gaps in a vital sector like agriculture.
And finally, we tackled the difficult choices being made right now to finance the energy sector, with this new fuel levy providing maybe some short-term cash.
Right.
But, as the analysis strongly suggests, failing to address the deep-rooted structural problems that keep leading us back to crisis.
Yeah, and understanding these dynamics, how they all connect, really helps you see beyond just the daily headlines, doesn't it? It allows you to grasp the real stakes involved and maybe appreciate the nuances in the policy and governance decisions being made.
It's about seeing how seemingly separate events, a court case, a currency move, a budget allocation, a new tax, actually fit into a much larger picture of a nation grappling with its foundational principles and its tough economic realities. And perhaps the provocative thought to leave you with today is this. Consider how that tension we saw playing out again and again, the tension between the urgent need for short-term fixes, those immediate actions like the GH1 fuel levy to get cash quickly, or transferring a large chunk of the DACF directly.
Right, the quick fixes.
And the long-term necessity of fundamental, often much harder, maybe politically painful, systemic reforms, like actually renegotiating those burdensome energy contracts or embedding a genuine culture of stewardship in local government from the ground up.
The deep, hard work.
How does that tension play out across all these critical areas we've discussed? What does it truly take for a nation, for its leaders and citizens, to prioritize those deep structural changes needed for lasting stability and development when the immediate pressures are always so high, so demanding?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it?
It certainly is. Definitely a question worth exploring further.